The lawyer's hands trembled as he opened the final envelope. Across the room, 3 grown children of the late Richard Ashford sat in their finest black clothing, dabbing at eyes that had not cried, waiting for numbers that would change their lives forever. None of them noticed the quiet, gray-haired man standing near the door, the one who had just been told, an hour earlier, that he did not belong in this room. Read this only after my children have revealed who they truly are, the envelope said. And in the next 10 minutes, the entire Ashford family would learn that the man they had spent 32 years treating like furniture was about to hold every single one of their futures in his hands. To understand how a butler ended up more powerful than a family of billionaires, you have to go back to the beginning, to a rainy October afternoon 3 decades earlier, when a 26-year-old man named Elijah Brooks walked up the long gravel driveway of Ashford Manor with a single suitcase and a letter of recommendation that had been typed by a woman who barely knew him. Elijah had grown up in a small apartment above a laundromat, raised by a mother who cleaned houses for a living and a father who left before Elijah could remember his face. He was quiet by nature, careful with his words, the kind of young man who noticed everything and said very little. When his mother passed away from a sudden illness, Elijah was left with nothing but her sewing kit, a few photographs, and a debt he could not pay. He needed work. He needed it badly. And when an agency told him about an opening at the Ashford estate, he did not hesitate. Richard Ashford was already a formidable man by then, a self-made industrialist who had built an empire in shipping and real estate through sheer will and occasional ruthlessness. His wife, Eleanor, was elegant and kind, though often unwell, and their 2 children, 6-year-old Victoria and 4-year-old Marcus, were being raised largely by nannies who rotated in and out of the house every few months. Richard interviewed Elijah personally, which was unusual for a household staff position, and something about the young man's steady eyes convinced him. "You'll be underestimated here," Richard told him plainly on that very first day. "People will look past you. Some will look down on you. Can you live with that?" Elijah had answered without hesitation. "Mr. Ashford, I've been overlooked my whole life. I don't need to be seen. I need to be useful." That answer stayed with Richard for 32 years. In the beginning, Elijah's duties were simple. He managed schedules, answered phones, ensured the house ran without friction. But something in him made him more than a servant. When Eleanor's illness worsened and she spent long nights unable to sleep, it was Elijah who sat outside her door with a cup of tea, ready in case she called. When 6-year-old Victoria had nightmares because her parents were traveling for business, it was Elijah who sat at the edge of her bed and told her stories about brave little girls until she drifted off. When young Marcus broke his arm trying to climb a tree that Richard had told him not to climb, it was Elijah who drove him to the hospital, held his hand through the tears, and never once told Richard whose idea it had been to disobey. The children grew up believing, in some unspoken way, that Elijah would always be there. And he was. He was there for piano recitals their parents missed. He was there for graduations when Richard was overseas closing a deal. He was there the night Eleanor Ashford passed away, standing quietly in the hallway of the hospital, holding a distraught 16-year-old Victoria as she sobbed into his shoulder because Richard himself was too broken to comfort anyone. But as the years passed, and as Victoria and Marcus grew into adulthood, something changed. Perhaps it was wealth. Perhaps it was the culture of a household where staff existed to be used and never acknowledged. Perhaps it was simply that comfort breeds entitlement, and entitlement forgets kindness. Whatever the reason, the warmth the children once felt for Elijah began to curdle into something else, a quiet, casual cruelty that neither of them seemed to notice they were practicing. By the time Victoria was 30, she had become the image of old money glamour, sharp, tongued, perfectly dressed, married to a man named Preston Cole who worked in finance, and treated every room he entered as though it owed him applause. Marcus, 2 years younger, had grown into a restless man who drifted between failed business ventures, funded by his father's money, always certain that his next idea would finally prove his brilliance. Neither of them had ever needed to struggle for anything. And struggle, Elijah had come to believe, was often the only thing that taught people to be kind. It was Victoria who started referring to Elijah, in front of guests, simply as the help. It was Marcus who once, during a dinner party, snapped his fingers at Elijah across the room to refill his glass, as though he were a dog being called. Richard, when he witnessed such moments, would grow quiet with disappointment, but he rarely corrected his children in public. Privately, though, he apologized to Elijah more times than either man could count. "They don't see you," Richard said one evening, the two of them sitting in his study lawn. After the house had gone dark, a bottle of scotch between them that only Richard drank from. "But I see you, Elijah. I see everything you've done for this family. One day they will understand what you were worth. I intend to make sure of it." Elijah had only nodded, uncomfortable, as he always was, with praise. "I don't need them to understand, sir. I only need to know I did right by this family. That's enough for me." But Richard, ever the strategist, was already thinking further ahead than Elijah realized. The final years of Richard's life were marked by illness, a slow decline that began with fatigue and ended, for years later, with a heart that simply could not keep fighting. Throughout that decline, it was Elijah who managed his medications, who drove him to appointments, who sat with him through nights of pain that no nurse could fully ease. Because Richard trusted no one else the way he trusted Elijah. Victoria visited when it was convenient for her social calendar. Marcus visited when he needed money. Elijah never left. In the final 6 months of his life, Richard began meeting privately with his lawyer, a sharp, quiet man named Gerald Whitfield who had served the Ashford family's legal affairs for over 20 years. These meetings were held behind closed doors, and even Elijah, who knew nearly every secret in that house, was not told what was discussed. All Richard would say, patting Elijah's hand with the frail strength he had left, was, "I'm making things right, my friend. For you. For all of it." Elijah assumed he meant a modest pension, perhaps a small severance to see him into his later years. He never imagined the truth. Richard Ashford died on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, with Elijah at his bedside holding his hand, and Victoria and Marcus notified by phone because neither of them had been present. It was Elijah who called the doctor. It was Elijah who called the children. It was Elijah who wept alone in the hallway after the body had been taken, because in losing Richard, he had lost the closest thing to family he had known since his mother died. But grief in the Ashford house was about to become a luxury Elijah would not be permitted to keep. Within 48 hours of Richard's death, Victoria and Marcus descended on the mansion, not as mourning children, but as combatants preparing for war. The estate was worth an estimated $4 billion, spread across real estate holdings, shipping interests, private equity stakes, and a staggering art collection that Richard had spent decades assembling. Neither Victoria nor Marcus wasted much time discussing their father's memory. Their conversations, held in raised voices throughout the mansion's halls, centered almost entirely on who would inherit what, who deserved more, and who had always been Dad's favorite. Elijah, moving through the house in a fog of quiet grief, tried to stay out of their way. But he could not escape their cruelty for long. It was Victoria who first turned her frustration toward him on the second night after Richard's death, when she found Elijah sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a photograph of Richard from years earlier. "Shouldn't you be preparing the guest rooms?" she asked coldly. "Family will be arriving for the funeral. I doubt they want to see the help sitting around crying like he lost somebody." Elijah looked up at her, stunned by the iciness in her voice, but said nothing. He simply rose, tucked the photograph into his pocket, and returned to work. Marcus was no better. 2 days later, when Elijah gently suggested that perhaps the funeral arrangements should follow the plans Richard had discussed with him months earlier. Marcus actually laughed, and said, "Since when does a butler plan a billionaire's funeral? Stick to polishing silverware, Elijah. Let the family handle family matters." The insults piled higher as the days went on. Elijah was blamed for a missing document that Victoria herself had misplaced. He was accused by Marcus of manipulating Richard in his final years for personal gain, an accusation so absurd and so painful that Elijah had to leave the room to keep his composure. He was made to eat his meals in the kitchen rather than the dining room, a rule Victoria implemented specifically, saying it's not appropriate for staff to sit with grieving family. The cruelest moment came the night before the funeral, when Victoria, exhausted and irritable, found Elijah adjusting the flowers in the main hall for the service the next day. "No," she said, arms crossed. "I think it would be best if you weren't here tomorrow. This is a family event, Elijah. A real family event. I think you should stay in the staff quarters. Or, better yet, just take a few days off entirely. Servants don't belong with family, not even at funerals." Elijah stood very still for a long moment, feeling something break quietly inside his chest. Some final thread of loyalty and hope finally snapping under the weight of 32 years of unspoken devotion. He did not argue. He did not remind her of the nights he had held her as a child when she cried, or the years he sat outside her mother's door, or the countless times he had protected this family's secrets at the cost of his own peace. He simply nodded, said, "Understood, Miss Ashford," and walked away. He did not attend the funeral. He stood instead at the edge of the property, near the old oak tree Richard used to sit beneath, and said his own quiet goodbye to the only man who had ever truly seen him. 3 days after the funeral, the family gathered in Richard's study for the formal reading of the will. Gerald Whitfield, the family lawyer, sat at the head of the table, a thick folder in front of him, his expression carefully neutral in the way that lawyers are trained to be when they know something the room does not. Victoria arrived in a black designer dress, her husband Preston beside her already, discussing, in hushed tones, what portion of the shipping division might be liquidated for immediate cash. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and impatience, clearly annoyed at having to be present for what he assumed would be a formality before the money was simply transferred to his accounts. Neither of them had invited Elijah. It was Gerald Whitfield himself who paused before beginning, looked toward the door, and asked, "Where's Mr. Brooks?" Richard specifically requested his presence for this reading. Victoria's face tightened. "He's staff, Gerald. I don't see why he needs to be here for private family business." Gerald's expression did not change, but his voice carried a quiet firmness that silenced the room. "Your father was very specific in his instructions. Mr. Brooks is to be present. I'll ask someone to fetch him." Elijah was found in the kitchen, quietly washing dishes that did not need washing, simply to keep his hands and mind occupied. When told the lawyer had requested him, he hesitated, uncertain whether he was truly welcome, but he followed nonetheless, wiping his hands on a towel and stepping into the study where Victoria and Marcus sat waiting with thinly veiled irritation. "Please sit," Gerald said, gesturing to a chair near the back of the room. Elijah did, folding his hands in his lap, feeling every uncomfortable stare directed at him. The reading began, as such readings typically do, with the transfer of smaller assets. Charitable donations Richard had arranged, gifts to distant relatives and old friends. Victoria and Marcus grew visibly impatient, their attention only sharpening when Gerald began, outlining the division of the primary estate. "To my daughter, Victoria Ashford Cole," Gerald read, "I leave the property on Belhaven Lake, along with a trust fund to be distributed under the conditions outlined in Section 12. Victoria straightened immediately. "Conditions? What conditions?" Gerald continued without answering. moving to the next section. To my son, Marcus, Ashford, I leave my shares in Ashford Shipping and Logistics, along with a trust fund to be distributed under the same conditions outlined in Section 12. Marcus frowned, exchanging a look with his sister. What is Section 12 exactly? Gerald finally looked up, folding his hands over the papers. I'll get to that. There is one more matter to address first. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope, its edges slightly worn, as though it had been handled many times before being placed here. For this exact moment, written across the front, in Richard Ashford's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Read this only after my children have revealed who they truly are." The room fell silent. Victoria's confident posture faltered slightly. Marcus leaned forward, his earlier irritation replaced by something closer to unease. Your father left specific instructions, Gerald said quietly. This envelope was to be opened only after certain events had taken place, events he predicted with, frankly, unsettling accuracy. He glanced toward Elijah, who sat very still, unaware of what was coming. He asked that I personally observe how each of you treated Mr. Brooks in the weeks following his passing. He was very clear that this letter should only be read if his prediction proved correct. Victoria's face went pale. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Gerald broke the seal and withdrew a single page, along with a small audio device. Your father recorded a message to be played only under these circumstances. I believe now is the time. He pressed a button, and after a moment of static, Richard Ashford's voice filled the room. Weaker than it once had been, but unmistakably his own, steady with the quiet authority he had carried his entire life. If you are hearing this recording, the voice began, it means my suspicions about my own children were correct. It means that in the days after my death, you treated Elijah Brooks with the same disrespect I have watched you show him for years. Disrespect I was too weak, for too long, to properly address. I am sorry for that weakness. I'm not sorry for what I am about to do to correct it. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Marcus stared at the recorder as though it might explode. The recording continued. Victoria, Marcus, I loved you both more than you will ever understand. But love does not mean blindness, and I have not been blind these last years. I have watched you grow into adults who believe that money entitles you to cruelty, who believe that kindness is something owed only to those who can benefit you. I have watched you treat the man who raised you, who protected you, who sat by your mother's deathbed, and by mine, as though he were furniture in this house rather than family. I have watched, and I have said nothing, and that silence is my greatest regret. The room was utterly still. Elijah sat frozen, tears beginning to form as he listened to a voice he thought he would never hear again. Elijah Brooks came to this family 32 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and a willingness to serve. What he gave us in return cannot be measured by any inheritance I could leave behind. He raised my children when I could not. He protected this family's darkest secrets without ever asking for so much as gratitude. He sat beside me through illness that would have broken a lesser man's spirit, simply because he could not bear to see me suffer alone. He sacrificed his own life, his own dreams, his own family, in service of ours. And in return, my children mocked him, dismissed him, and if this recording is playing, likely told him he did not belong among family, even at my own funeral. Marcus lowered his head, unable to meet Elijah's eyes. Victoria's carefully composed. Makeup was now streaked with tears she could not stop. So here's what I have decided. Richard's voice continued, growing firmer, more resolute. I'm not leaving my fortune to my children outright, because I do not believe, as they stand today, that they have earned it. Instead, I am naming Elijah Brooks as the sole executor of my entire estate, with complete authority over the distribution of every asset, every trust, every dollar I have accumulated in my lifetime. Victoria gasped audibly. Marcus's face went white with shock. Each of my children will receive their inheritance only if Elijah, in his judgment, believes. They have earned it through honesty, through humility, through demonstrated compassion. For others, particularly for those they have the power to look down upon, Elijah will have full discretion to release funds gradually, to withhold them, or to redirect them entirely, as he sees fit. This is not punishment. This is an opportunity, the only one I know how to give my children now, to become the kind of people I always hoped they would be. Gerald paused the recording for a moment to allow the weight of the words to settle. Then continued. Elijah, Richard's voice said, softer now, almost tender, if you are hearing this, I owe you an apology. I was too proud to give you fully in life. You gave his family everything, and we gave you so little in return. I cannot undo the years of disrespect you endured in this house, but I can give you the power to demand better, going forward, not just for yourself, but for anyone who might one day be treated the way you were. I trust you with this responsibility because you're the only person I have ever known whose integrity never wavered, not once in 32 years. Whatever you decide to do with this power, I know it will be the right thing. It always has been. The recording ended. The room sat in stunned silence, broken only by Victoria's quiet sobbing and the sound of Marcus's shaking breath. Gerald set down the recorder and looked toward Elijah. Mr. Brooks, the legal documents confirming your role as executor are already filed and notarized. Your father was very thorough in ensuring this could not be contested. The authority is yours, effective immediately. Every eye in a room turned to Elijah, the same man who, 3 days earlier, had been told he did not belong among family. Now he held, in his quiet, steady hands, the entire fortune and future of the Ashford family. For a long moment, Elijah said nothing. He looked at Victoria, whose face was a mixture of shame and fear. He looked at Marcus, who could not seem to lift his eyes from the floor. And he felt, rising within him, not the triumphant vindication he might once have imagined in his angriest, most exhausted moments, but something quieter, heavier, more complicated. I need some time, he finally said, his voice steady despite the tears still drying on his cheeks. This is not a decision I intend to make in anger. He rose and left the room, walking out to the old oak tree where he had said his goodbye to Richard days earlier, and there alone he allowed himself to finally grieve, not just for Richard, but for 32 years of a life spent making himself small so that others could feel large. In the days that followed, the mansion's entire dynamic shifted in ways no one could have predicted. Victoria, who once refused to let Elijah sit at the family table, now found herself requesting meetings with him, her tone careful, almost pleading. Marcus, who once snapped his fingers to summon him, now waited outside Elijah's small office for 20 minutes without complaint, simply hoping for 5 minutes of his time. But Elijah did not use this power the way they feared. He did not seek revenge. He did not humiliate them the way they had humiliated him. Instead, he did something far more difficult and far more transformative. He set conditions not designed to punish, but to teach. He required Victoria to spend 3 months working without pay at a nonprofit organization that supported domestic workers and caregivers, an assignment she initially resented, but which, over time, began to soften something in her that had long been hardened by privilege. He required Marcus to personally apologize, in writing and in person, to every household staff member he had ever mistreated, a humbling task that forced him to confront the pattern of cruelty he had never before been asked to examine. He did not release their inheritances all at once. He released them slowly, in stages, watching not for perfection, but for genuine change. When Victoria, months later, was found quietly covering the medical expenses of an elderly housekeeper without telling anyone, without seeking credit, Elijah knew something in her had shifted. When Marcus, once dismissive of anyone he considered beneath him, spent an entire afternoon helping a groundskeeper's son study for a college entrance exam, Elijah allowed himself, for the first time in months, a small and quiet smile. He never moved into the master suite of the mansion, though he certainly could have. He continued to live in the modest staff quarters he had occupied for 32 years, a choice that puzzled many, but that made perfect sense to him. Power, he had learned from watching this family up close for 3 decades, was not something to be worn like a crown. It was something to be carried carefully and used only in service of making things right. A year after Richard's death, at a quiet dinner Elijah organized, not in the grand dining hall, but in the same kitchen where he had once been forced to eat alone, Victoria and Marcus sat across from him, no longer as heirs waiting on his judgment, but as something closer to the family Richard had always hoped they would become. "I used to think," Victoria said quietly, staring into her glass, "that you were just part of the house, like the furniture. I never once thought about what your life outside of us might have looked like. I never once thanked you." Elijah offered her a small, tired smile. "You're thanking me now." Marcus, uncharacteristically humble, added, "Dad was right about you. About all of it. I just wish it hadn't taken losing him to see it." Elijah looked between them, thinking of the 32 years that had led to this moment. The suitcase he had carried up the driveway as a young man with nothing, the years of quiet sacrifice, the insults he had swallowed, the love he had given without asking for anything in return. He thought of Richard's voice on that recording, trembling but resolute, finally giving him the recognition he had never sought but had always deserved. "Your father gave me power," Elijah said finally, "but I never wanted power. I only ever wanted to matter to this family." It seems, in the end, that's exactly what he made sure of. The Ashford fortune, once destined to fracture a family already broken by entitlement and neglect, instead became the very thing that rebuilt it, not through wealth but through the quiet, unshakable integrity of a man who had spent a lifetime being overlooked and who, when finally given the chance to matter, chose not revenge but redemption. And in the end, that choice proved far more valuable than any inheritance money could buy.